Hi, and welcome to another round of Patrick Global Truth Bomb Riffs The Con. And I'm recording this on Friday, June 21st at 10 a.m. my time. And I'm pleased to welcome to this dialogue, which I'm very interested in actually, a gentleman by the name of Jerry Ashton, who is the co-founder of the highly respected Undue Medical Debt, which recently celebrated its 10th anniversary and abolishment of nearly $12 billion in medical debt for over 7 million Americans, and has new charitable interest are veterans. This sounds reasonable, as Jerry, a Navy veteran, having served as a journalist variously aboard the heavy cruiser USS Bremerton in the South Pacific, editing the newspaper for the Barbers Point Naval Air Station in Hawaii, and finishing off doing public affairs work at the Navy CB base, in Port Hueneme, California. This goes way back to a four-year tour of duty from 55 to 59. Wow. And as for that 501c3 charitable private foundation he recently created called End Veteran Debt, its mission is twofold: abolish veteran debt and by way of reduce veterans suicide. End Veteran Debt is reframing history's famed June 6th, 1944 D-Day as 2024's Operation Debt Day, in a campaign to abolish $80 million in veteran financial burdens, symbolically $1 million per each of the 80 years since the original landing at Normandy beaches in France to liberate Europe. The purpose of Operation Debt Day is to liberate veterans, this time from unpaid and unpayable debt. So, Jerry, I mean, that's a mouthful, but as I was reading through your information that you had provided me prior to this and prior to our mutual contact, I was really intrigued by the entirety of the volume of the amount of debt that you've been able to manage, which is quite extraordinary, but B, that you were actually in the debt collection service industry and you were located in Manhattan, and you had happenstanced into the Occupy Wall Street movement, which incidentally, I made my first documentary surrounding that. And I was in Zuccotti Park the day that the NYPD blew it up, after I had traveled 3,500 miles around the country to about 26 Occupy encampments. And I really was amazed by OWS at that time, primarily because I was hoping it was going to be sort of a reaction from the everyman who was going through at that time the great financial crisis. But instead, most of those people that I represented, the tens of millions of people that had been train wrecked because of the 2008 great financial crisis, weren't there. It was different people. They were there in New York. They were there kind of in Chicago. They were there in Portland, San Francisco, but it was a mixed bag. It was mostly younger students and a whole garden variety of people that you might expect at protest, going back to my experience with I'm trying to think of the World Trade, in Seattle, the World Trade Organization, all those sorts of things. But look, to start this conversation up in a way that I think will bring us to an incredible intersection, is talk to me about when you were in debt collection in New York after being in the Navy. What triggered you to want to pursue writing off debt, both in the medical collections arena as well as ultimately veterans debt?
Well, I guess it could be said I'm kind of a rebel, no matter what it is whether I'm wearing a uniform or partying with a bunch of occupiers. The truth of the matter is, in my industry, I was a wild, wild thing. I was unusual because I questioned what we were doing, why we were doing it, and I was known as a gadfly, someone who just kept annoying my own industry by coming up with feedback to make their work better. So I was a renegade to begin with. So when after some 30 years of working in that industry, I wandered into Occupy Wall Street. And having been, of course, a Navy journalist, I had my camera and my notepad with me. And by the way, I really want to hear more about your documentary. That's fantastic. So when I walked in my experience, and by the way, I was there also on that same day when the police raided the place. I was there. We were probably no more than 2 or 3 yards away from each other. So I was there for a different purpose, and that was uh, to put a public face to one of the complaints that Occupy had, and that is they could not understand, nor can I, nor can our reader, viewer imagine how an industrial nation can allow its citizens to go bankrupt just because they got sick or hurt. So that resonated with me as a debt collector, my job, and I was the guy with the white hat because my job was to get the money that wasn't being paid to my client for services rendered. Well, I would only work for organizations to begin with that had a legitimate business, legitimate product, legitimate service, and that the debt was itself was legitimate. So I was naturally of a bent to hear this. Yes, that's wrong, and it's a wrong that needs to be righted. So I reached out to a buddy of mine in the collections industry who used to work with me. His name is Craig Antico. And I said, Craig, there's something here of interest. Let's look at it. Okay, what is that? I said, well, these guys are like anti-debt collectors and they need our help. He says, that figures. Okay, what do we do? And so we decided to become the back office for what the Occupy had called the Rolling Jubilee. Now, the Rolling Jubilee was a 501c4 charity, which allowed it to fundraise for the purposes of publicity and lobbying and things like that. So they needed to raise some money, and they figured a pretty clever way to do that was to raise money and go out to the debt market to buy medical debt for pennies on the dollar and then abolish it. Except they had one problem. They didn't know the industry. They were not going to be invited to debt buying conferences. And we had suits, and we had the other two qualities aforementioned. So we agreed to do the work that they needed to have done. They would raise the money, and they raised over, I think it was maybe $80,000. We ended up abolishing $30 million worth of payday loan debt, medical debts, educational debt. So Craig and I were pretty happy. We bought the debt for them, and then we repurposed our collections agency software so that instead of sending out collection letters, it would send out forgiveness letters. Now, how's that sound so far?
Well, let me start with this. First and foremost, when I was, and I paused when I was reading your bio because one of my biggest influences in my life was none other than Hunter S. Thompson, the father of Gonzo journalism, and he was serving in the Navy at approximately about the same time, and I think his first assignment was down in the Dominican Republic, which interestingly enough became his first novel, which then became Johnny Depp's kind of recreation of that through a film that maybe some people might be familiar with called The Rum Diaries. And so kudos to you to go from sort of that background and then get into the machine eventually of, debt collections, which is really fascinating, and then wind up in a moment of sort of epiphany during the Occupy Wall Street movement. I want to tee you up for this next sort of evolution of how things went, just from the perspective of what I experienced at the time versus what I now know. So that was approximately 15 years ago. And when I first made my first documentary, it's because I went through the great financial crisis, otherwise known as the housing collapse. And when we got on the road, literally, I got on the road to make this documentary on the first day that Occupy started, which was September 15th, 2000.
September 17th.
Sorry, September 17th. You're absolutely right. I was confusing that with the day that Lehman collapsed, which is, of course, September 15th, 2008. September 17th, 2011, right?
2011, yes.
2011. And my colleague and I really just surfed the entire wave up and down from starting, in the Northwest, Seattle, Portland, all the way down the West Coast, all the way through the Southwest to the Midwest, all the way up through the Rust Belt, and then eventually we got to DC. The Yellow Brick Road went right to Oz to DC, and then ultimately Manhattan. When I wound up right next to you, when the NYPD was shutting it down in November, 2 months later, it was right about November 17th, as I recall, and we had this huge march ultimately as a reaction on the Brooklyn Bridge. I remember that they were casting these images of a whole new world as possible at that time. It was one of the most inspiring things I'd ever been a part of. After we actually were involved with running into the NYU and occupying the NYU campuses in Midtown or in Manhattan, there was all sorts of crazy stuff going on at the moment. But the reason I set that all up for you is because, like me, maybe like me, I had to reconfigure my entire brain to understand what I was looking at. Because prior to that catastrophic time period, I thought the law worked. I thought that the system worked. I thought that we had adults that actually did underwriting, that did the right sort of corollaries, whether it was home finance, whether it was any type of loans for car finance, through student finance, through so on and so forth. And then I also ultimately thought that, well, we have professionals in the industry that know how to manage risk for investors, that obviously do their underwriting, so that a situation that we were in the midst of seemed so befuddling to me because I didn't fully understand it. And it took me another literally 13 years to fully understand all of the elements of what our financial system has become. Now, that's a lot to absorb, right? Because we both know the system is the system, but can you give us some clarity in terms of being in the debt collection business for 30 years, how you looked at the whole modus operandi of finance, and what you might, I think you referred in one of your articles as predation. Let's just start there. Where were you coming from at the beginning of this catalyst? And again, I want to remind people that are watching this, you have written off $10 billion with a B, $10 billion in medical debt, which is extraordinary. But for the uninitiated, particularly now, it's a bit of a political, fireball to talk about student debt write-offs and so on and so forth. Can you basically deconstruct the industry, and then ultimately your viewpoint on finance, and ultimately what is debt and how is it paid off and to whom? Maybe it's a compounded question, but I know you can unpack most of that.
Well, I love three-dimensional chess. So here we are, September 17th, 2011. I'd already been affected and aware of and was writing about the financial disaster that preceded it. And yes, indeed, within the community of Occupy, the people that were there were just pointing out the effects of the system. And why is it that it is the way that it is? So the best adventure to take is, first of all, follow your own path. In my case, I knew finance inside and out from the point of view of money, from the point of time that service is delivered to the point of time that the money is collected. And bill collectors are the arm of Wall Street. You used my service, you bought my product, you pay me the money. And so the debt collector is an army of organizations, army of people that are devoted to making money by going after debt that has not been paid to the original creditor. So far, that sounds fair enough because, you did the work, you deliver the goods. Why am I not being paid? Well,
let's point out too, real money was exchanged. That's
real money. Yeah. So I'm caught up like you are. I'm caught up in the game, and I'm doing my job. And then all of a sudden, I realize that the rug is being pulled out from under us financially, because It's a con. Uh, it is, the
By
system
by
is,
the way, I got to interrupt you. That's the name of my work that you're not familiar with. I did a 6-part. So my first documentary on that was Occupy Wall Street inspired, which I asked these questions. It was prologue to me doing a 6-part, 5-part, 6-hour series deconstructing what you just called what it is. And that's the title, called The Con, which is the largest revelation of the largest criminal conspiracy, financial conspiracy, and cover up in history that never ended. And so I'll plant that seed, but we're coming from the same place. Please continue.
so here we are both having a revelation. I walked into Occupy Wall Street as a debt collector. I walked out of Occupy Wall Street as a debt forgiver, all because I was enlightened. All of a sudden, I started asking questions that I never asked before and searching for the answers and realizing that the best thing that could have happened to me is I just became disillusioned. Of course, those of you who are listening who like to live in illusions might want to not go any further in our conversation, but I wanted to get rid
This,
of the
this is the
illusion.
red pill moment.
Exactly. So here I am in an alternate universe that I can sort of semi-create myself. And that was, mind you, that was what, 12, 14, 10, 12 years ago, something like that, 13 years ago. Now, so to
Approaching
bring
13
how
years.
I got to my revelations and continued my trip down the rabbit hole. Number one, when Occupy began to fade, we were kicked out of our home base. The Rolling Jubilee came up to me and they said, well, to me and Craig, and said, well, we're going in a different direction. Now, by the way, Craig was being paid. I was just a volunteer. You know, he had a family to feed. I was just being the good guy. But when they came up and said they were going in another direction and they were closing down the Rolling Jubilee, Craig and I looked at each other and we said, we can't let this happen because we were hooked. It felt good to forgive debt. It felt good, especially since much of it was by anybody's sense of right and wrong, predatory, and that was a shock. And the unshocking was that we could do something about it. So Greg and I decided to start RIP, standing for Rest in Peace Medical Debt. And by the way, it's changed its name recently to Undo Medical Debt, UNDUE, Medical Debt. That's what happens when you retire. They change the curtains, they change everything. So, but that's okay. They're doing a great job. And by the way, it's no longer 10 billion or up to 12 billion. And in place are some of the sharpest professionals you'll ever meet at being able to combine fundraising with do-gooding. And Undo Medical Debt now is paying attention to policy. It's decided, like we did years ago, that rather than sweeping up after the parade, maybe we should talk to the donkey and the elephant at the head of that parade so we don't have to do that cleanup. But I digress. So we started RIP Medical Debt and we proceeded to starve to death. Horrible. Horrible. Friends and family maxed out every credit card. Craig and his wife hawked the family silver and jewels. His wife asked him one day, she says, why are we going into debt to get people out of debt? It was a fair argument. Why were we doing that? Aside from the obvious, which is insanity, you'd have to be crazy to do what we were doing, we felt compelled. So we stuck it out until a most amazing thing happened. And that is, as the only one of its kind, the only one in existence, a 501c3 that would actually abolish medical debt, we were discovered. Who do you think discovered us? Ever hear of a guy by the name of John Oliver?
Oh, is that where it was in 2016, I believe, right? Did
Yes.
you do a profile? Okay, wow, that's amazing.
Yes, here we were, and here's the backstory to this thing. Um, John Oliver has a lovely program. And what he loves to do is send people up the flagpole, people, ideas, concepts, evildoers, whatever. And I think we know where he got the idea, but his marketing team, promotional team said, hey, here's a way to get somebody's attention. Um, Oprah got a lot of attention for giving away $7 million worth of cars. We know of a way that we can go to the debt market and buy medical debt for pennies on the dollar, and you out Oprah by giving away $15 million worth of medical debt. Grand idea. And so they started working on it until this is my guess now. I'm not claiming to know everything. My guess is that somebody got word at HBO's home office that John Oliver was about to put himself in the role of a forgiver. And there's certain things that you can do as a comedian, and certain things you can't do. One of those is to forgive medical debt. So I'm sure it was frantic. They started reaching out, trying to locate people who could actually perform that service with them because they were going to air that program in 2 weeks. And I won't go through the entire story, but it's amazing in itself how he located us. But we ended up in the HBO headquarters in Manhattan, sitting across the table from producers and lawyers and what have you. Every question they had, we had the answer because we know what we're doing. And every aspect of legitimacy, we met that. So we shook hands on it and we agreed that we would be the charity to whom John Oliver would give away that debt. And so the night of we asked, by the way, could you, kind of mention this on the air? And they said, well, that's not our policy. Well, okay, we're here in service. So the night that the program is being aired, my wife and I are sitting in our apartment in Manhattan. We have a split of champagne in front of us, just in case we were mentioned, we'd celebrate. Well, the show was a 30-minute show, and the first 20, 25 minutes, he's taking names and kicking tail in the debt collection industry. These bottom feeders, these nefarious people, all of which, of course, was true, the way that he put it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that service, that these undue, ill-gotten gains, and what we're going to do is we're going to become the new queen of daytime TV. We're going to forgive $15 million worth of medical debt. And we're going to do it through a 501c3 charity known as RIP Medical Debt. Our logo appears above his right shoulder. He goes over and he says, and this debt will be forgiven and no tax consequences to the recipient. He goes, are you ready to do that, audience? And they say, yes. He goes over to a big red button. He hits the big red button. Money comes down from the ceiling and our website crashes.
Look, I remember seeing that now that you said that. That was when I first started tuning into John Oliver, and I remember that episode. And kudos to you. And it's so cool that I didn't put two and two together. So wow, that's amazing. But I want to start with the basics because, look, one of the things that I had to reconfigure with my brain was how our system works. Okay. And so, again, if everybody's doing underwriting correctly, if those are managers in the whole system that understand risk and they understand credit risk and they're operating on behalf of investors and they're investors who have a direct corollary to someone who takes out a loan, be it an auto loan, be it a home loan, be it a credit cards, any junket of credit, or finance, medical, so on and so forth. although obviously there's different variables of why one would get into debt given, the scenarios. Obviously, medical debt is something that we can't plan for, particularly if the economy goes sideways and we lose our income and all of that kind of stuff. But can you please explain to people like myself initially, that if you take out a loan, it's your responsibility to pay a loan back. There's a reason you took out the loan. There's a reason why you are what they say buyer beware, which is a whole other aspect of this thing that you'll probably go into. And if you don't, then I'll remind you, and then we'll go into predation that much further. But can you give us the notion of risk through entities that provide loans in the category that you were collecting for, and then kind of give us a composite picture, A plus B equals C. Who's providing the debt, under what terms, who's collecting the debt, and why?
Okay, I'm going to frame it as Operation Debt Day. I'm going to use the veterans comprise 6% of our population. That's it. 1% of our population since 9/11. But these people create and bring about some of the worst experiences of debt. As example, there's debt of necessity and there's predatory debt. Predatory debt, on the face of it, is something that takes advantage of the person who's taking out the loan or getting the money. We're talking about payday lenders. We're talking about car notes. We're talking about scam tuition schools. This is predatory. Then there's the debt of necessity. For example, I'm working with a veteran by the name of Michael Thorin, disabled, lives in Alabama, a small town. By way of the VA not responding quickly and properly to his needs to be given a disability, he ends up losing his home, losing his job, losing his health, going into debt because the VA would not, because the healthcare in the VA, by the way, is discretionary. Just because you're a veteran does not mean you're going to get taken care of. It's up to the VA's discretion. Okay, so a debt is created, and now I'm looking at two villains. One is the VA, and I'm putting this in quotes because there are many great things that the VA does. I'm talking about where the slippage is. I'm talking what they need to listen to correct. So I'm looking at the fact that here's an amazing organization, does great things for veterans, and too few of them fall through the cracks, which means there's civilian debt that's created that is not paid for by the VA because the VA does not recognize it. That creates further additional debt. I talked to Michael Thorin just yesterday. What did he have to do? And by the way, he's on oxygen, can barely do things around the house. He had to go out and refinance a loan so he could pay for his wife's medication, as well as put food on the table. Now, I want you and I want your listeners to ask me about this fellow, to find out what we can do for him. Now, let's take a look at debt. Where does it come from? How is it generated? How's it processed? What does it mean to us? I have no sympathy for people who create debt that is predatory. No sympathy. They could all be put in jail for all I care. Then there are people who are good people who do extend monies to our veteran, for example, or to anybody, you and me, to start a business, to do this, to do that, personal debt, corporate debt. And we're given that money or that access to credit under the expectation that it'll be repaid. And we all do our best to repay that. In all my years of collecting, especially medical debt, I've never met a credit criminal. I've only met people who could not pay the bill. These are the people that end up in collection. No matter how good they might be, good a citizen, what have you, they're in trouble. Well, I could expand this into national debt and international debt, but I'd really like to keep it personal. In the world of finance, a certain percentage of people will fail. That's called write-off. In fact, I started and I'm still writing a book called Written Off America. We've been written off by the people who finance us, by the people who use us, by the people who make money off of making money off of making money off of us. Being caught in the matrix, being caught in this system, the only way out of the box is to think out of the box. The problem with thinking out of the box is that the instructions are outside written on the box. How in the hell do I get out of this mess? Well, society provides us one thing, and that's called forgiveness. That's one thing. There's also a financial ability to declare bankruptcy. That's a good thing. And that's written into law. In fact, it goes back in biblical history to the Jubilee, in which every 50 years slaves were released and every 7 years debts were forgiven. Well, since we don't have much of a tribal law and it's not written in Hebrew anymore, what we have is the code that allows us as civilians, as people, to declare bankruptcy. Some very honorable people have declared bankruptcy. I've done it twice. And Trump, I don't know how many times, but he's done it a
You've done
few
it
times.
6 times. Can I insert just a couple of things?
You sure can. Please hop in.
So, first of all, in a capitalist system, bankruptcy is necessary, and it's a beautiful option, honestly. And it's interesting that you brought up the Jubilee because I'm close with an economist who I think is the foremost expert in this topic. He's a gentleman also from New York, such as yourself, a gentleman by the name of Michael Hudson. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Hudson. He did.
No, David Graeber I am, but not
Well,
Michael.
he worked with Graeber also. Okay, so especially on the anthropological side, because Michael Hudson did his studies at Harvard, but he's the foremost economist in the world on a number of items. Ironically, he's a self-proclaimed Trotskyite, but at the same time, he was the utmost capitalist from this perspective. He was the top Chase economist for balance of payments going back to, I'm going to say, the 70s, when he first discovered the whole global paradigm of oil and exchange rates and all of the rest of it, where he first dove into those stuff. But he gets into eventually he did decades of work on the Jubilee, and he's been calling for the outright Jubilee, really going back, quite frankly, to Occupy. But I wanted to just kind of insert this as kind of a play on words so we can kind of like get the people to where they need to understand. So first and foremost, basic question. What is the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy? Do you know? This is not going to be an economic quiz. I just use this to establish the nature of debt. Go ahead.
So start over and explain that to me.
Okay, well, just briefly, the way the government of the United States is set up, we have a fiat currency. Congress determines what we're going to budget. The federal budget is different than state budgets. The way we collect tax revenue is different and everything else. And money is a currency of exchange and value that we obviously have the dollar that has become also the world's reserve currency. So simply put, debt from finance, Wall Street operators, whether it's housing, whether it's cars, whether it's medical debt and everything else, there's two paths. There's monetary policy by way of what the Federal Reserve enables by way of M1 currency, but also interest rates. If you're a primary dealer broker, be it a too big to fail institution, a systemically important financial institution like Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and so forth, you have a potpourri of loans that you provide, but the way you operate is a primary dealer broker that you're enabled in first position to be able to borrow money yourself, to be able to loan out to the economy. and there are certain terms that you're supposed to be able to provide that liquidity. Okay. So when the entire country depends, if you're not part of the top 1% and you've got to be able to borrow for college, if you got to be able to borrow for your housing, if you got to be able to borrow for medical downstream, particularly when you were talking about predation, i.e., if you're a service member. Let's just start there briefly. If you're a service member, typically, what are some of the characteristics that you might offer or proffer you regard as predatory lending for those that are, quite frankly, let's say, early in their military career?
Very simple. Every state has a military base of some sort. Drive to that military base and circle around it and take a look at the businesses that exist. Look at the used cars. Look at the new cars. Look at the payday loan places. Look at the pawn shops. And then, of course, more likely take a look at that local bank, which will offer that veteran a credit card with higher interest rates. And if they can't afford that particular bank, they have to go to another bank that has even higher interest rates charged. So usury, which we don't call it anymore, this is called doing business and a return on investment and bullshit like that. Okay. So this is what when that guy gets out of boot camp and goes to his base, his commanding officer knows that he's going to be a victim. He just can't help it. He or she is 18 years old. He or she needs that new car. He or she needs that whatever that they need. And pretty soon they get in debt. And when they get in debt, then they have to go deeper in debt. So the root
Let
of
me
all,
stop you real quick, real quick. So again, you established that, from what I heard, that they're not, shall we say, the most sophisticated borrowers. They're not necessarily either undergrad graduates of economics. They don't necessarily fully understand the nature of economy slash budgeting, and they have the opportunity to get loans for products that they want. They're in a prime position to be able to jump into something they don't fully understand. That's what I'm hearing you describe as predation, correct?
absolutely, and that's inseparable from the same problem of students who go to school and borrow these high interest loans. How in the hell can an 18-year-old make that kind of a decision? When I was first part of Occupy Wall Street, even before then, I was aware of student debt. And the first organizations, the special interest groups within Occupy that I joined was student debt. And I'm looking at these kids around me that have 30, 40, 50, $100,000 worth of debt. They will never pay that off in their lifetime. And it's criminal of those who lent that money to them to have done that.
So that goes to my point about underwriting. So the idea that we kind of configure in our minds as borrowers, and also anybody who lives in the United States and anybody who thinks of the nature of capitalism as this wonderful system of risk reward. You get opportunities to borrow to get you through what you need to do, which is incumbent upon you to pay that back. But yet, like you just described, in many cases, a young person who doesn't have a college education, doesn't have any experience in the marketplace, will immediately want more than they can afford. And they are gratefully offered those products by these lending institutions, whether you had talked about several times with no definition, which I'll just proffer a quick examination of. Payday lenders. Payday lenders provide short-term loans at extremely higher interest, and then penalties beyond comprehension. And then they become, we used to think of, I mean, this was, usury is one thing, but when you think of loan sharks, that's illegal. There's a reason that we don't allow people to lend money and then go break your legs after the fact or throw you at the bottom of the Hudson River. That's what we would regard as the mafia. Okay, so
Yep.
we have a financial system, however, that has professionals that have to do underwriting, but yet They provide incredible volume of loans at high interests. In fact, as it turns out, the higher the interest, the higher the yield and the higher commission for the guy in the food chain that's actually providing that predatory line
It's all greedy. It's all greedy.
under terms that are buried in usually big time contracts that you'd have to be really an attorney to understand. But as it turns out, most attorneys don't understand these terms anyway, particularly as it related to the 2008 great financial crisis. But I digress. To make the point though, again, for the layman, when you take out a loan, many people want to always blame the person who takes out more than they can manage, but yet they don't understand the full amount of circumstances, nor do they understand the incentive to why brokers would be providing ridiculous predatory loans to people that they know that can't afford to pay them back, and yet they do so anyway. Why do you think they do that?
Why don't you just name the 7 deadly sins and pick out the one that's most appropriate? How about greed? It's all essentially greed. Everybody's in collusion with Wall Street because they're all getting a piece of the action as it rolls down to the poor veteran, citizen, what have you.
Okay, I'm going to just make a very quick point, and then I'm going to listen to you throughout because I want to get to so much more of what you're doing and what, because we've got to get to the veterans. And I do want to point out, just as an antidote, that on my journey initially, I met veterans around the country, many of whom eventually committed suicide. Just so you know. I put them on camera to understand what were the terms of the loans that they got, particularly veterans loans, and what the servicers were doing in terms of collections vis-a-vis what led them to suicide. Okay. And I know that's very, very integral to what you're involved with, but I just want to, I want to point this out to the viewer, and I also want to point this out to you, and I'd encourage you, and I'll share my work with you. But I worked with a gentleman by the name of William K. Black, who is the foremost criminologist in the United States, who was responsible for putting 1,700 white-collar executives in prison during the savings and loan crisis, which followed the run-a-bank crisis of the 70s, and it built all the way through the, of course, the same tactics that we saw in the tech bubble, and then ultimately in the Enron era frauds that led to, of course, the great financial crisis, which was the mother of them all. And we've been living in the aftermath of that the entire time. But what we all need to understand is, you have said it brilliantly just based on intuition, but it's an actual process. It's called control fraud. CEOs, based on modern executive compensation, are bonus based on short-term volume of the loans that they provide through the system, through what we call Gresham's dynamic, which is when good ethics drives bad ethics out of the business. So if you can lie, steal, and cheat your way to get loans approved based on terms that the client doesn't understand, because what they do is they mask it as, how much is your income? You can afford to pay this much back. We can supposedly loan you this amount. And then, if you're in a house, you can refinance that because a rolling loan knows no loss, because the house price is going to go up. And that's a part of a whole nother set of circumstances. But going back to your point in terms of predation, and then ultimately the point that I want to make, and then I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to let you maneuver us through this. So the Federal Reserve always has an interest rate, and it also has money supply, and the Treasury has its role as well. But financial apparatuses, be they central, the too big to fail banks, the systemically important banks, right, that all got bailed out after the 2008 great financial crisis, which was the whole purpose of Occupy Wall Street to begin with, they too should, and throughout our history, are supposed to operate by some of the same measures of credit risk. Meaning, a bank can simply go bankrupt by providing too many loans that can't have the volume paid back because they were given to people that they knew would never pay them back. But we created this whole strata of like derivatives and credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations that mask who is the end game of who's getting paid, because it's a giant casino. But everything is based on the volume, based on predation, getting people in the loan as quickly, as rapidly as they can, that these people will never be able to pay back. And then when shit hits the fan, What happened with the 2008 great financial crisis is because they choked on their own cooking of this entire ginormous galactic fraud scheme called control fraud. They turned a $4.5 trillion housing market into an $800 trillion global calamity that fell. And the government, and I'm going to ask you this question, because I don't know if you've ever seen these terms, even though you were deep within Wall Street. And Graeber never knew these answers, which is the most astonishing, all things considered, because it led me on my journey. How much did the Federal Reserve provide Wall Street when they were bankrupt? They had no collateral value. They had no ability to pay back to their investors and all of the other mechanisms, be they hedge funds and private equity and yada, yada, yada. How much do you think the government provided them in liquidity between 2009 and 2016? I'll give you that realm. Just throw out a figure.
Well, first of all, I won't even venture into that because it's so insane to begin with. So you're going to provide that number. What I will provide for you is the fact that it's proof that there's collusion. It's proof.
It's called racketeering. It's RICO.
Racketeering, exactly that. This is a RICO case if there was one. So mind you, I'm just another guy citizen. I did my work for many, many years and I retired and I did this and I'm doing that. But I pay my taxes and I do all the good things. And the only person who benefits from it really, because I'm almost, too many Americans are payday to payday. And too many, going back to the thing that really annoys and hurts me the most is that debt is a social determinant of suicide.
Let me finish this up though, because I want you to finish the whole next 15 minutes on focusing on this and what the veterans assistance is all about. But I just need the viewer to understand this because I'm starting to penetrate. My work was pillow choked, just like we saw in this stupid Trump case by way of, catch and kill by way of National Enquirer with Stormy Daniels and yada, yada, yada. We were pillow choked by BlackRock. Okay, and I'll tell you why, because of this information I'm just about to provide you. So the Federal Reserve had 98 secret meetings between the first TARP revelation that we had this dysfunctional Congress with all of the other guys at that time, be they, the Democrats and Schumer and Pelosi, or the Republicans, McConnell and everybody that was that time. Do you remember everybody was like, oh my God, their jaw hit the floor when we found out that we did the Troubled Assets Relief Program, which was buying bad debt, okay? The government proclaimed through fiscal policy $700 billion. What we provided, do the drum roll, what we provided in Occupy Wall Street was my entry point to this, but they never fully understood it. We provided 33 trillion in 2009 while we were all out trying to figure out what the hell was going on. They were backdooring. You remember when those guys were out on the palatial penthouse on Park Avenue drinking champagne while Occupy was walking underneath them? You remember that?
The famous picture of those guys.
We got 33 trillion. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion. Our GDP is 25 trillion a year, all cumulative debt. I mean, everything in the economy. They got 33 trillion for a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of people, plus another 16 trillion, which makes 49 trillion through quantitative easing by 2016. All goes on the debt ledger of the Fed, which throws it into debt. The whole process at that point. We provided another 22 trillion in 2019 because of a repo run. All of this was pre-COVID. So, but again, to reframe for people who are like, if you take out a loan, you've got to be able to pay it back, and you have to feel guilt to the degree that you would commit suicide to pay it back. But they don't know they got set up, and they don't know that the people that set them up got away with, to date, since 2009, $71 trillion on the low end for basically bankrupting everyone else. So if you could move forward, given that sort of context.
I'm going to be like your listener. I'm just floored by the immorality of it. floored by the fact that we haven't left the nobles and the peasant system behind. We just have a modern version where the nobles are really much more noble, much more rich, and the so-called peasants and fewer and fewer of them who even own a part of the land, much less the home that they or apartment they live in. It is beyond comprehension the evilness of it.
You got $10 billion to write off medical debt for people because you understand the system as a debt collector. You're in the process of raising $80 million for veterans, but I want everybody not forget that this stuff gets written off anyway. Can you take, okay, so
Yeah, let's take a look at that first so people really have an understanding that this is not wasted effort. And by the way, we're not raising 80 million. We're abolishing 80 million, 1 million at a time. And that 1 million at a time, when you go to the debt market and you buy a veteran's debt, all we have to do is raise between $30,000 and $50,000, and we've abolished $1 million worth of veteran debt. Now that's how that market works. Now, why do that? I mean, they've already gone bankrupt. They've gone this, it's debt from the past. No, it is a moral obligation that sits on their minds. It's on their back. And to give you an example of the cruelty of that, when I discovered that veterans owed debt, medical debt, Craig Antico and I went down to Washington, D.C., sat down with the House Subcommittee on Veteran Health, and we asked them, why do we see veterans showing up in the $1 million worth of portfolios that we find? Why are veterans medical debt in there? Well, it's very simple. Their debt did not qualify to be reimbursed or paid for by the VA. As a matter of fact, and this is the words that came out of this one person's mouth, the VA has refused to pay $6 billion worth of debt accrued by veterans outside of the VA system. $6 billion. That same year, I put on a national summit on veteran debt, getting people into New York City to sit around and figure out what is this all about and how can we end this? Nobody. I've even put up a website, endveterandebt.com, end veteran medical debt. Yeah, endveteranmedicaldebt.com with a petition. Somebody's got to show up and sign that petition. But the VA, if it's ever noticed it, they've never reached out to me. I'll give you another exciting example. The VA wants to get rid of suicide. They want to lessen suicide. As many as 40 members of our military who leave the service die every day by suicide. Well, they want to lower that. So they put on a campaign called Mission Daybreak, and they put up a $20 million prize. If your organization come up with a unique way to reduce veteran debt, you can have a share of this $20 million. Well, what happened? 1,371 organizations, including my own, put in their way of reducing veteran suicide. 40 were selected. 40 out of 1,370, and these were the usual suspects with the usual tried and right answers. It boggled my mind. So I started an organization called veteranmissionpossible.com. And at Veteran Mission Possible, we got together, we got into collaboration, we broke down the walls, and we said, how can we work together to become solution providers? And then out of that came endveterandebt.org. And out of that is coming, and thank you so much for giving me this airtime, Operation Debt Day. Let's relieve veterans of debt. Instead of landing in Europe and Normandy beaches to liberate Europe, let's liberate veterans this time around 80 years later.
Well, it's an incredibly important objective, and kudos to you for all of the success you've had. I want to remind people to think of it from this perspective. I mean, and I have some guilt along the way too. I mean, from this standpoint, I'll never forget after 9/11. You know, I went to a Marine recruiter and I had a job as a producer, and I've been a producer ever since. But I was like, I'm going to sign up. I'm going to sign up because I'm ready to go fight. And I said, when do we get to go invade Saudi Arabia? And the guy's like, what are you talking about, Saudi Arabia? And that was like my first sort of connectivity that even the guys in the service who are recruiting don't even know who attacked us on 9/11. And nobody still does to this day. But I want to make the point that we've had veterans that served multiple tours in places like Iraq, many, many, many tours in places like Afghanistan. There are people that served 6 tours in Afghanistan only to come back to the United States, get themselves in a pickle to where the roofs caves in on the debt because they were set up in predatory loans that they didn't fully understand, to end up homeless and then eventually commit suicide. It's a national disgrace. Meanwhile, you've got Mr. Bone Spur president, who's convicted of 34 felony convictions and many, many hundreds of more that he hasn't been convicted of, but never served in the military, whose son-in-law just got 4 billion from Saudi Arabia. And then the military industrial complex has endless amounts of budget. The Pentagon loses trillions of dollars a year. The fraud that goes into our financial system is excruciating. And then people that actually went and worked, did 6 tours to supposedly democratize the world or provide freedom. Come back into one of these circumstances of which there's no way out. And then there's a lot more to it. We barely scratched the surface. But Jerry Ashton, tell us again where people can go to find out more information. What would you ask them to do to get involved, to help, to maybe to donate? And what is the end game? And again, I want to remind people, you expunged $12 billion in medical debt. I mean, that's extraordinary to me. But it's an incredible operation. But people, please don't lose sight of the fact we gave Wall Street $71 trillion since 2009 to basically destroy the world.
Yep. Well, like in any emergency, the adult has to put on the oxygen first on the airplane. The adult before they take care of the kids. So the first thing that's important is to find those local charities. So many of them. You just Google veteran charities and you'll find so many that are near you that could use your help. We're working on a national basis and we're looking for partners, charitable partners, as well as businesses, in order to be able to co-fund this. We can co-raise this. One person can't do this. One organization is unlikely to do this by themselves. $30,000, $50,000, that's $1 million for the veteran debt. Help us meet that $1 million. The 80 million will take care of itself. Jerry Ashton, write jerry@endveterandebt.org. Go to our website, endveterandebt.org. Go to our veterans group, veteranmissionpossible.com, and sign a petition at endveteranmedicaldebt.com. And I can't thank you, Patrick, enough for giving me the opportunity. And by the way, for teaching me a lot. You're a wonderful source as well. Thank you.
Well, hopefully we just scratched the surface with our relationship, and I'll send you some of my information that'll help further it, because it does really put everything into perspective when you realize that. And again, this is the most important thing that I bring to the table that nobody else in the country has or will, and they won't. And I've gotten pillow choked. Federal Reserve Act 13.3 was used illegally to maneuver. I mean, look, the Federal Reserve can uptake the national debt, monetary policy to whatever it needs to do. But nowhere does it say in the statutes that you provide tens of trillions of dollars of liquidity to a racketeering enterprise that was using deceptive acts and practices to basically racketeer their way to stealing and looting $71 trillion through what is the DOJ could have easily brought down as racketeering. They're demonstrating every single day what Donald Trump is guilty of. And yet Wall Street got away with everything that I'm talking about infinitum. And, can you give us, just in terms of all of this depressing and horrible sort of reality, can you give us sort of in going out here, some manner of a reflection of the goodness that came from relieving people's debt, either through medical debt or veterans debt? Can you give us an example of something you've experienced firsthand?
Well, here's the process, and this is why we will succeed in spite of what seems to be indomitable odds. Number one is awareness. If people don't know about a problem, they can't do anything about the problem. So the very first thing that happens through media and through organization programs like yours is wake up. Nobody wants to wake up because it's too painful to be disillusioned, right? Get disillusioned so that you can deal with reality. Awareness is the first step. Second to that is people have to be touched. For example, when I was abolishing medical debt, once people became aware of it, it touched them so much that 10 years ago, nobody talked about medical debt. Today, you can't get a newspaper without becoming aware of the fact that people are touched by medical debt because people get educated. There are listeners right now and viewers of your program that have got a glimmer of, I need to know more. So education is a very important aspect of this. Get educated. You're an educator. Most important of all, once somebody is aware and they're touched and they're educated, there's only one thing left, and that's action. Whether it be feet on the street, whether it be donating to charity or starting one, whether righting wrongs, whatever it is, get yourself in action.
I love it, but just one example of someone that has benefited from having their, what does it do to change their lives? What have you experienced?
We have so many documented instances where people write us and say, you know what? That change in my credit score just got me a chance to get a car. That money that you took off my back is enabling me now to go to the bank and get a loan for a home. I can get a home now. I can put tires on the car. There's no one example. There's 7 million people that the work that I and Craig Antenko did in creating RIP medical debt, now undo medical debt, 7 million people I'll never meet. I met maybe a half a dozen. I even discovered my niece was one of the people that had debt abolished because of something that my charity had done. So it's around you. You just go to a neighbor. They don't talk about how much money they owe and how they're being chased by a debt collector, but they are. Too many of them.
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to do in addition to that, and that's great news, is to get somebody out of the frying pan and into the fryer, through debt. Obviously, I want people to get income. I want to see, us to reconfigure the paradigm. And there's a lot better ways to spend $71 trillion than on fraud. There's a lot of problems we have in this country that we could, quite frankly, turn our innovation and our brilliance in the right direction, as opposed to just, sucking the blood out of a turnip. Basically, is how this all goes down. There's a lot more to it, but thank you so much, Jerry, for your time. Again, everybody check out everything that Jerry had laid on us, and then hopefully we can continue this dialogue further. All the best to you, my friend.
Thank you so much.
Take care.